Alors, bonjour à tout le monde. Hello, everyone. I am going to do this presentation in English, but we can speak French at the end of the talk for questions and answers. For today's lecture in the series entitled Renewed Histories or Nouvelles Histoires, we are very pleased to welcome Kenny Cupers. Kenny is professor of architectural history and urban studies at the University of Basel, where he is also head of urban studies and head of the Department of Social Sciences. Prior to becoming a scholar, Kenny was trained as an architect at the University of Leuven in Belgium and studied photography and cultural theory at Goldsmiths College in London. He received his PhD in architectural and urban history from Harvard University in 2010 and taught in the US before coming to Switzerland. Kenny's PhD dissertation was published in the form of the book The Social Project, Housing Post-War France, translated into French at the Édition Parenthèse in 2018, under the title La banlieue, un projet social, ambition d'une politique urbaine 1945-1975. The word definitive is very dangerous in history. Usually, historians never use this notion because history is a process of constant revision. An interpretation can be challenged by new ones, and this series of lectures is a good sign of this. But let's dare to say that this book is somehow the definitive history of the seemingly well-known grands ensembles. In this book, La banlieue, un projet social, Kenny explains how the modernization of housing in post-war France was conceived not solely as an architectural and urban transformation, but also as a project of social experiments. Architects, urban planners, and designers came to collaborate with policymakers, economists, sociologists, and a variety of experts at a moment when the social sciences were gaining much importance. Although the project of the Grands Ensembles ended up proving rather unsuccessful, as you know. Besides this work, Kenny is also the author of dozens of articles and of several other books or co-edited volumes, questioning the transformations of Berlin or the importance of considering use in architectural history and not only finished objects, as well as reflections on the neoliberal turn in architecture. He has recently turned his attention towards Africa to examine the circulations with Europe at the time of imperial powers. In his new research project, The Earth That Modernism Built, he is looking at how the roots of architectural and urban modernism are embedded in the colonial experience, and how they were shaped by the study of local populations and the environment. And I think this presentation of today will propose a look at this ongoing project. So now, Kenny, the floor is yours for your presentation. And after that, we will have a little time for questions and answers with the audience. Et comme Kenny comprend parfaitement le français et le parle très bien, vous aurez la possibilité de poser des questions en français à la fin, et si besoin, je traduirai. Donc, Kenny, c'est maintenant à vous.
Absolutely. So feel free to ask in French. I'm going to, unfortunately, not speak French today because it's a bit rusty. But thank you so much for this very generous introduction, Paul. It's really an honor and a pleasure also to be included in this exciting series, which asks a very provocative question, how the grand narratives of architectural history are being challenged by these new approaches that Paul already alluded to. And one of the grandest, perhaps, such narratives is that of architectural modernism, I believe. So in this talk, I hope to challenge some aspects of that narrative by exploring the relationship between environmental determinism, a key belief of European empire, and the 20th century discourse of modern architecture in Germany. And I'm interested in this relationship in order to better understand how the biopolitics and geopolitics of 20th century modernism are in debt to a strand of environmental thinking that is rooted in colonial and thus racialized understandings of planetary inhabitation. Environmental determinism, very broadly speaking, is the belief that human culture is shaped by the environment. This widespread 19th century idea legitimized European colonialism and imperial expansion by arguing that racial character was defined by geographical setting. And a key proponent of this way of thinking was the German geographer Friedrich Ratzel. In his book Anthropogeography, Ratzel claimed to present a universalist model of humanity, which explains civilizational complexes based on their geographical environment. At the same time, he was also a staunch advocate of German imperial expansion, and his notorious concept of Lebensraum was used by the Nazis to legitimize eastward expansion and annihilation. In the course of the 20th century, environmental determinism became increasingly important for architecture, just at the moment when it was increasingly abandoned in geography and other scientific disciplines. And this is perhaps best exemplified by the modernist conviction that the designed environment can shape the human. This drawing here from the Bauhaus pedagogy of Schlemmer and Meyer suggests that when humans are conceived as organisms immersed in environments that can be precisely qualified or quantified by various sciences, their behavior may be predicted and potentially transformed by those environments. So with this assumption, modernist architects harnessed an environmental conception of the human as an organism for the design of spatial, psychological, social, and technical arrangements. And such an approach fueled architects' self-assigned task, I would say, of engineering the social order, at least some architects. Historians of German architecture might frown upon the suggestion that designers like Hannes Meyer, celebrated leftist designer and member of the cooperative movement in Switzerland, might be in debt to 19th century imperialist thought. Yet I believe if we shift our perspective from political ideology to historical epistemology, so epistemological continuities and transformations, we might develop new understandings of the coloniality of architectural modernism. So to explore these epistemological continuities and transformations, the work of philosopher Georges Canguilhem has offered an invaluable starting point for me. In his 1952 text, The Living and Its Milieu, he showed how a wide range of 19th and 20th century scientific disciplines, ranging from biology and ethnology to psychology and geography, engaged with the question of what constitutes life through the concept of milieu. His historical epistemology highlighted geography, particularly the work of Ratzel, for developing an explanatory model of humanity as informed by its distribution on the planet. And Canguilhem regarded this as a fundamentally deterministic approach in which doing history consists of reading a map. But he also argued that with the growing awareness that humanity is a geographical factor, as he called it, this determinism would ultimately harbor its own reversal. And a school of thinkers would come to assert that, quote, in a human milieu, man is obviously subject to a determinism, but it is the determinism of artificial constructions. As Bauhaus pedagogy illustrates, architecture has not only been a privileged terrain of experimentation, which such artificial constructions of the environment, it has also been a field for their conceptualization. So in what follows, I take inspiration from Canguilhem to excavate how two historical moments or two alignments between environmental thought and the discourse and practice of modern architecture in Germany. The first is, and now I have a kind of structure here. My talk is divided in two parts. The first part focuses on the slippery concept of the Siedlung or settlement around the turn of the century in Germany, to explore this alignment that I alluded to already between imperialist geography and the architectural reform movement. And second, I explore how this alignment informed the soil ecology of Raoul Heinrich Francais, whose scientific work was formative of architectural functionalism in the 1920s. And so I end the talk then with a final look, a kind of revision of Hannes Meyer. All right. Germany is no longer an unlikely context to examine the colonial dimension of architectural modernism. In her 2017 book, Colonialism and Modern Architecture in Germany, architectural historian Itohan Osei-Mweze has brilliantly demonstrated how modern architects and designers were influenced by a public culture imbued with racialized representations of the colonial world and its inhabitants, and also how colonial expansion and its attendant building practices influenced really in fundamental ways the discourse and practice of modern architecture in Germany. And I believe her scholarship opens up new avenues for exploring the relationship between colonialism and internal colonization in Germany, because the occupation and settlement of overseas territories was only one mode of German colonialism, and perhaps not the most important one, as historian David Blackburn has argued. So in the forthcoming book, of which this presentation draws, I examine in more detail how research on vernacular architecture and traditional villages was weaponized in the Prussian project of internal colonization, which you see a few images of here. And this project aimed to settle and govern racialized and classed populations in Central Europe. A project that was undergirded by Germany's pioneering environmentalist movement, the Heimatschutz movement, or literally homeland protection movement. And this shows how architecture then came to serve as an instrument, not only of overseas colonialism, but also of internal colonialism. So this suggests that in addition to examining architectural representations of colonized or non-Western societies, which I think has become very prominent and very productive in architectural history today, we might also attend to the coloniality of environmentalism, of German environmentalism at home, as I will try to explore today. So key to understanding this colonial dimension of the environmental movement or the Heimatschutz movement, I suggest, is the notion of settlement, or the Siedlung or Siedeln as a verb in German. And by 1900, this notion of settling could refer to a wide range of practices, from the establishment of artists' colonies and reform communities in the German countryside, to the building of new company housing and garden cities, but also, and importantly, of course, to settling people abroad in the New World. Even in provincial Germany, the so-called back to nature movement around the turn of the centuries was fueled by romantic notions of the colonial frontier, with pioneers who would settle on supposedly virgin land to start a new life. For example, the founder of the vegetarian reform community Eden near Berlin, pictured here on the left, started with his experience based as a colonial settler in South America. Another example on the right is Hellerau, considered a well-known example of the German garden city movement, which combined environmental and social reform ideas with new experiments in housing and industrial design. But Hellerau was also called a Siedlung, or colony, rather than a garden city at the time. And historian and anthropologist Anne Stoller has argued that such semantic slippage, as she calls it, of the notion of colony or settlement reveals the persistence of colonial power in the metropole. Settlement was certainly a term with significance on many levels, but its importance for both German colonialism and architectural reform becomes clear when we turn to the work of Friedrich Ratzel. In his first geographical treatise, Anthropogeography, pictured here, published in 1881, Ratzel attempted to generate general laws governing the interaction between humanity and the earth. And evidence for these general laws, he claimed, was to be found in the ways in which people inhabited and made use of the land on which they lived. And he makes these kind of grand claims here, for instance, that a thinly spread population generally generates a nomadic state, whereas an agricultural society would tend towards democracy because it would bind itself more firmly to the land. So such outrageous, by today's standards, such outrageous claims have led scholars to characterize Ratzel as a proponent of environmental determinism. Yet the coloniality of this way of thinking is not so much its static determinism, I would argue, than its evolutionary conception of humanity's relationship to the natural world. Attention to this evolutionary logic demonstrates not only the importance of his work for imperialism, for understanding imperialism and its logics, but also for modern architecture. So Ratzel used biological principles to understand human society. Inspired by Darwinian evolutionary theories, like so many of his colleagues at the time, he posited that the struggle for existence was essentially a struggle for space. Space not of an individual, but for the people as a whole. So rather than being fixed to a timeless habitat, people were inherently on the move, so Ratzel argued. And territory was their arena for competition and adaptation. So Ratzel here assumed that for superior, what he deemed to be superior peoples, racialized groups, migration would coincide with territorial expansion. And this was essentially the process of civilization. So of course, all these ideas meant to legitimize white supremacy, not importantly though, not as an unchanging biological given, but rather through the specific ways in which people supposedly related to and transformed the land. In the first volume of his work, Ethnology, here, which was devoted to Africa, which he never visited, he started his analysis with an example from the Midwestern plains of the United States, surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, as we will see. And he wrote about the American farmer who had developed foresight and technologies, he claimed, that did not so much free him from the land, but rather tied him to the land in multiple ways. And because the farmer had tied or kind of multiplied his ties to nature, he was less prone to its whims. And of course, the comparison here is between the farmer, the American farmer, and the indigenous Native American as a figure. And for this kind of logic, it was material culture, including architecture, that provided tangible evidence for this theory. Colonialists, Europeans, had long compared representations of African lightweight housing structures with material construction of European architecture, right? Creating a contrast between the so-called primitive and modern urban civilization. But Ratzel's theory differed somewhat from this because his idea of racial hierarchy was based on the degree to which people had rooted themselves in the land. So not an urban civilization, but rather an agricultural one, as this quote here suggests. This geographic theory of settlement was inspired by his visit and field work, if you want to use a contemporary word for it, of German settler communities in the American Midwest. Generations rather of farming communities here had gradually transformed nature into a domesticated cultural landscape. At least so it is presented here in this very famous painting by the American but Prussian-born, interestingly, painter John Gast. So such Kulturarbeit, as Germans would call it, or works of culture, of creating culture, was both the essence of human development and a means of colonization, so Ratzel claimed. So of course, this settler colonial ideology obscured the dispossession and displacement of indigenous polities, as well as the history of indigenous environmental technologies, whose sophistication far exceeded what Europeans wished to recognize, despite also their existential reliance upon these technologies in their practices of colonial expansion. The German colonial atlas here, published in 1893 and then ever since in quite high volumes, by the anti-Semitic cartographer Paul Langhans shows how popular this ideology was, or how popular its reach was. And his atlas included not only Germany's official colonial territories here, but also the presence of German migrants across the world. Historian Christian Kopp has taken Langhans's work as a key to what she has conceptualized as discursive colonization, right? The kind of discourse of German colonization, of which images and maps like these are a part. But this work also embodies a large-scale material transformation of the earth. Despite Ratzel's fascination with German settlers in the American Midwest, his theory also contrasted with liberal dynamics of settler colonialism. In the United States, after all, was also a cautionary tale rather than only an inspiration, as German settlers here had assimilated to America. So a key question for German imperialists like Ratzel was how to channel German settlement or German emigration into imperial expansion. That is, how to prevent emigrating Germans, like here in the United States, from adapting so much to their new environment that they would lose their loyalty to the German Empire. So more instructive to him was the example of German settlements in South America. By 1900, around 250 or 260,000 Germans had already settled in the southern Brazilian province of Rio Grande do Sul alone, and of course also in Argentina and other countries. There were many German settlers. Here you see a drawing of Blumenau, one of the kind of more well-known examples of these typical, or they're considered typical German settlements located in this region. The farming and building practices of German settlers in South America, which ranged from laying down roads and constructing new public buildings to establishing farmstead and planting of trees, all of that was understood as Kulturarbeit, as cultural work that would strengthen German identity abroad, and that would kind of create these nuggets of German culture and German identity in a kind of foreign context. This settler colonial ideology negated not only the endurance of indigenous forms of life, but also the role of the state, the Brazilian state in this case, because it had in fact encouraged this colonization of sparsely populated southern provinces as part of a project of racial improvement. And a similar thing happened, in fact, in Argentina. So this might seem all quite far removed from the discourse of modern architecture. But in fact, if we look more closely, the thinking of architects like Paul Schulze-Naumburg, co-founder of the Heimatschutz movement in Germany, was strikingly aligned with these colonial ideas. In Kulturarbeiten, Schulze-Naumburg has famously written about a culture of the visible, as he called it, which he understood as comprising not just houses and monuments, bridges and streets, but also clothes and common customs, forests and cattle breeding, machines and national defense, unquote. So for the architect as I said, co-founder of the environmental reform movement or Heimatschutz movement, design was not just about the making of these things individually, but it was about how they all worked together in transforming, quote, the entire surface of the earth at the hands of humans, as he writes here. This statement might be read as part of a turn-of-the-century interest in the Gesamtkunstwerk, or the total work of art. But I think its significance also lies in this planetary, environmental conception of design, which resonates with Ratzel's anthropogeography. So reading their work together gives substance to the ways in which late 19th century Germans imagined their relationship with the land not as statically determined, but rather as the result of an evolutionary process. Ratzel theorized this process as settler colonialism, while Schulze-Naumburg framed it as a matter of modern design. So it's no accident, I believe, that Schulze-Naumburg began his list of cultural producers, as he called them, with the farmer, in his conviction that the rural world was the most primordial because it was the most rooted, Schulze-Naumburg followed Ratzel and many other German conservatives at the time. This was also very much anti-urban, of course. In a 1906 article entitled "The Metropolitan Disease," the architect wrote about the urban poor of Germany's big industrializing cities and the need for them to settle in the countryside, where they could supposedly live more harmoniously in the national homeland. Right, so here you see this slipperiness of settlement and how it's instrumentalized. During the 1920s, the architect became an influential Nazi who espoused this racist hatred in the book Kunst und Rasse, Art and Race of 1928. And that, of course, made him instantly notorious in architectural history. Yet already in the Kulturarbeiten, written around the turn of the century, the architect wrote about the racial character of the land, as he called it. He said the physiognomy of the land. And physiognomy was popular in the 19th century as a technique of assessing a person's character based on the features of their face. And of course, physiognomy had, for this reason, been an important basis of scientific racism. So using that word is not a coincidence. The visual appearance of the landscape for Schulze-Naumburg was an embodiment of the moral and racial character of the people who built and inhabited that landscape. So the architect presented Heimatschutz or environmentalism as a defense against an impending disfigurement of the landscape by foreign urban elements. So Heimatschutz for the architect was not just the desired quality of the built environment, it was also a project of countering the dangers of racial degeneration. And with these famous oppositions, you see here one of them, kind of good examples and bad examples, the architect inspired a whole generation of architects. It was really one of the best-selling books in the pre-World War I era in terms of in the field of architecture. So this suggests that his ideas had an enormous impact. And this kind of racial environmental theory informed architecture in subsequent decades, far beyond the kind of reactionary corner of Heimatschutz, or to which Heimatschutz became assigned in the Weimar years in the 1920s. So with farmhouse gables, hipped roofs, eyelid dormers, etc., this type of architecture, newly designed architecture, as you see here, was drawn from vernacular building traditions and village landscapes. And despite this picturesque inspiration, however, many of these designs did not shy away from being kind of formally repetitive and responding to a growing demand for standardized, or typified rather, design, as also promoted by the Deutsche Werkbund and other modernist designers. So more remarkable even than the formal consistency of these design elements, and you see these kinds of projects across the German Empire at this time, is how they were imagined to work, how they were imagined to achieve a desired social and psychological effect. And here, garden designer Willy Lange explains how he thought that this kind of architectural design would impact on people. And this conviction of a kind of aesthetic psychic effect, as he called it, echoes the kinesthetic theories that have recently been examined by architectural historian Zeynep Çelik-Alexander, who explores in her book how experimental psychology assumed a kind of causal relationship between the physical environment and the psychological condition, and how this impacted Bauhaus design theory. But this conviction of a kind of causal relationship of the built environment also is in depth to a colonial epistemology of settlement. Because after all, Lange and his collaborators, and the architects I just mentioned, upheld this type of architecture as an instrument to change society by settling people on the land, or by rooting people. So rather than a static, just to conclude the section, rather than a static determinism by which geography defined humanity, German imperial environmental thought created a crucial opening for designers to shape the relationship between people and the earth. This opening, and we will see this having a career of its own in architectural modernism in the next section, I argue was stuck under the veil of a kind of conservatism, right? Of supposedly reproducing the natural principles of order and a respect for things as they are. But this was in fact quite a modernist or a reactionary modernist move. All right, how am I doing for time? I'm a little bit over halfway, so I hope it's good. So I hope people are still with me. Maybe I'll slow down a bit. All right. So in this section, I want to show how this alignment or this idea of settlement, and especially the relationship between soil and settlement, continued to play a role in the 1920s, also in Bauhaus modernism, even though I think this is not so much acknowledged in the current scholarship on the Bauhaus, which attempts to or continues to, I think, celebrate its much more internationalist tendencies. All right, so from soil ecology to architectural functionalism. Several architectural historians have argued for the centrality of ecological thinking within the Bauhaus, an orientation that its teachers and students developed further as they moved abroad. Such environmentalism in architecture exceeded an emphasis on gardening or landscape design, and it didn't just rely on a kind of back to nature movement or the use of organic metaphors. It was also driven by an intellectual engagement with scientific knowledge. Oliver Botar and Ute Pürschke, amongst others, have traced a strong biocentric orientation in the work of Bauhaus designers through the work on what was called the technical performance of plants by the Austrian, or rather Austro-Hungarian biologist Raoul Heinrich Francais. And we see here an image that illustrated one of its many books. Francais actually studied fine arts before beginning his scientific career as a biologist, and he became a devoted vitalist philosopher and also a popularizer of science, following in the footsteps of Ernst Haeckel. And Haeckel, in fact, was the one who coined the term ecology, at least in German, Ökologie in 1866, to describe interrelations between communities of organisms in an environment. So Francais was part of a longer movement of what historian Anne Harrington has referred to as scientific reenchantment. Around the turn of the century, scientists and cultural reformers in Germany, but also elsewhere, aimed to replace the kind of mechanistic worldviews that the 19th century seemed to have opposed with a new holistic science, one in which the materiality of things itself could be imbued with vital energy. And this actually presages some of the kind of new materialist discourse that we see today. Here in this image, for instance, Francais compared the functioning of a mechanical pump to the way in which a plant pumps water from the soil. So such biocentric ideas, or biotechnic, as Francais called it himself, had a major impact on all three of the Bauhaus directors, so Walter Gropius, Hannes Meyer, and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. And they shaped in this way the conception of architectural functionalism. Now, what is overlooked in these accounts, I would argue, is that Raoul Heinrich Francais also had a scientific output that was not limited to botany. In fact, he was first and foremost a soil ecologist who pioneered organic farming together with his wife, Annie Harrach-Francais. Their lifelong interest in the relationship between soil and human culture influenced architectural modernism just as much, I will argue in the remainder of my paper. So such an influence not only extended to an understanding of, or extends our understanding of architectural functionalism, it also shows how this idea or this approach in architecture is indebted to a colonial epistemology of planetary inhabitation, the one that I've just sketched out in the previous section. So Francais was a pioneer of soil ecology as he studied the mutual influence of living organisms in the soil based on its kind of physical and chemical conditions. So soil, and you see this kind of suggested in the image on the right, perhaps, was for Francais an organism of organisms, and it's kind of systematic coexistence of a living community that responded and adapted to the environment. In other words, his work showed how organic life was intimately connected with inorganic or dead matter in a metabolic system or a cycle of life. So conceptualizing the soil in this way, in a kind of monist way, as philosophers have called this, meant seeing things as life and life-giving, and seeing the soil as standing in a vibrant relationship to human life and to humanity as a whole. And he used the term cultural biology or Kulturbiologie as a kind of a mode of analysis of this relationship between the soil and human culture. So in his 1907 book, Forays into a Drop of Water, he wrote very in kind of lyrical ways about his newly adopted home in Franconia, and you see the picturesque medieval town of Dinkelsbühl here in this sketch on the left. So he argued that this medieval town was essentially an organism, something naturally grown, a result of all adaptations that make up the struggle for existence, so he claimed. Early 20th century Heimatschutz and other advocates, of course, had also spilled much ink celebrating these villages and medieval towns in terms that were very similar to Francais. And the scientist was in fact very closely connected to this reform milieu. So his insistence on the relationship between the life of soil and the process of human settlement aligned also with Schulze-Naumburg's and Willy Lange's ideas, as they made similar kind of allusions to a determinate relationship between the environment and people. In his analysis of Munich, which you see here on the left, right after World War I, and the kind of chaotic and rebellious atmosphere of the city, he matched the region's 5 soil types with 5 phrenological types of people. So he claimed that just as the flora and fauna of the suburbs of Munich depended on the clay soil that predominated in this area, so did the inhabitants. This again seems outrageous from today's perspective, but he made claims, for instance, to argue that the stocky or peasant features of this clay population of the suburbs also would be able to explain their behavior, even their taste in fashion. And this could be explained, therefore, from the soil on which these people lived. By the turn of the century, many other scientists would frown at such ideas, right? And because these are based on kind of neo-Lamarckian ideas of environmental influence. But vitalism and this kind of biological approach of Francais seemed to give such racial environmental thinking, continued purchase. And this was relevant particularly to architecture. Not coincidentally, the same year as this book on Munich was published, his wife, Annie Harach, published her own book on race called Race, People of Yesterday and Today. And this was really a treatise that posited race as the guiding principle of human history. The book ranged from a discussion of Mendel's principles of inheritance and the anatomy of prehistoric humans to the causes of the French Revolution. And all of these things would contribute to her argument that all human creation, quote unquote, our cities and languages, quote, our fashions and dress and pleasures, our state form and our administration of justice are all dependent on race. Francais' book, Der Weg der Kultur, here published also in 1920, this was apparently a very productive time for both of them, revealed how this vitalist theory of the relationship between soil and human settlement was undergirded by an anti-democratic, authoritarian, I would say, project of biosocial order, a project that I believe needs to be accounted for in its influence on modern architecture. In this book, he presented an analogy between the cellular state, as he called it, of a biological organism and the so-called human state of the town. And he meant by that the political constitution of the town. This idea echoed the work of the Baltic German biologist Jakob von Uexküll, who's seen by many as a pioneer of modern ecological thought as well, who had his own impact on modern architecture. For both Francais and von Uexküll, the natural cellular unit of the village, like that of the modern state, was the patriarchal family. So in a healthy state, they both argued, all cells were interconnected and they worked in a strictly hierarchical, orderly fashion. And and Francais illustrated this with these kinds of drawings here. You see on the left, this is a kind of abstraction of the drawing on the right, which shows you a kind of street in an existing village. Dorf is a village, right? So there's the bakery, the mill, the courtyard, the acker, the fields, etc. And so he analyzed this village, this supposedly unchanging village and standalone village, as an organism, right? Seeing how all these elements, these production organs, as he called them, of the village, worked together in a kind of metabolist order. And this was a kind of unchanging, for him, an unchanging way in which society would ideally work. When things wouldn't work so well, that he discussed as well under the chapter, The Pathology of the Biological State, arguing that problems and malaise resulted not only from social democracy, which he was not a fan of, and he saw as a mass of undifferentiated people, but also endangered by parasites, as he called them, coming from within and beyond Germany's borders. Now, Francais was less rabidly xenophobic than von Uexküll, and also less anti-Semitic, but his conceptualization of state power was remarkably similar. Plants and animals, he argued, have their well-ordered state structure with an intricately organized cultural life. Undergirding this biological vision was ultimately death. And Francais had no qualms in writing that, quote, all violations against a really useful organization are always punished by death, which is why only those that managed the defeat have been or are left. So in other words, central to these ideas of a natural social order was the dying off of unbefitting, unsuited forms of lives. And this shows you the kind of widespread nature of eugenicist ideas that circulated in the 1920s, well beyond the boundaries of Nazi or reactionary politics. And again, I think this influence should be accounted for more in modern architecture. So colonial expansion, Francais claimed, and capitalist food production were all natural techniques by which a species, the human species, could develop. And so a rendering like this presented colonialism as a transhistorical technical capacity of all organic life. To conclude then, on Francais, in line with the long historical process by which colonial modernity had produced society as something separate from nature, Francais' vitalist-inspired work was motivated to overcome that separation. Yet in imagining this supposedly re-enchanted world of vibrant matter, as Jane Bennett might call it, Francais actually perpetrated or perpetuated the alienating practices of an external nature in the service of a society shaped by supposedly natural principles of social order. So Francais' vitalist philosophy and thinking around human settlement did not in effect dissolve the epistemic boundaries between nature and culture, in the ways that feminist science and technology studies scholars like Donna Haraway have conceptualized the relationality of all of life forms. Rather, his work replaced an abstract social nature produced in the interest of accumulation with a biopolitics of settlement that I would suggest entrenches colonial relations between humans, plants, and the earth. So this, and now I conclude with a little snippet of Hannes Meyer. This throws a different light, I believe, on some of these canonical figures of architectural modernism. Meyer's 1926 text, The New World, has been widely cited and understood as an early treatise of architectural functionalism. And this text is explicitly in depth to the work of Raoul Heinrich Francais. As the image of the rotary tiller here on this famous page already suggests, Meyer was not only interested in the kind of bare bones conditions of modern dwelling, but also was interested in soil and continued to be interested in soil, drawing from debates on land reform, agricultural modernization, and settlement planning. Key to that interest is the Swiss agricultural engineer Konrad von Meinburg, which architectural historian Gregory Gremega has recently shown. Von Meinburg actually had a considerable impact, not only on Meyer, but also on other Bauhaus designers. And here you see a citation of his article, The Culture of Plants, Animals, and Humans, published in the magazine of the Bauhaus, which was also widely quoted. And in this text, actually, von Meinburg argued for the importance of agricultural modernization based on the imperialist geography of Friedrich Ratzel, arguing that human culture was nothing more than a struggle for the limited breeding ground between limitlessly growing peoples. So as we look at Meyer's first commission, first independent commission, for instance, here, the design of Freidorf in Muttenz, not far from where I teach, actually, on the outskirts of Basel, this has long been celebrated as a unique realization of cooperative ideals. The project was indeed commissioned by the Swiss Cooperative Union, with which Meyer worked very closely. But if we look beyond the influence of the cooperative movement, this design might also be traced back to some of Francais' ideas about soil and settlement and his biopolitical vision of social order. Because Freidorf was really conceived as a diagram of a living organism, a society in miniature, and you see that perhaps most clearly in this plan. And it suggested that in this colony, as it was called at the time, social and political structure coincided with biological principles of habitation. So this was not a design for living with the land, for living with the environment, but rather for rooting people in the land. And while this project did not aim to return people to a kind of rural agricultural past, it did embody a very radically simplified humanist ecology that bore little relationship to its surroundings. It was very much a colony in this sense. So to conclude, even though in the 1920s, modernists like Francais and Meyer resolutely abandoned the architectural styles of the Heimatschutz, which was now ideologically tainted with Nazi ideology, their thinking remained in depth to a strand of our environmental thinking rooted in colonial and thus racialized understandings of planetary inhabitation. So in short, what I've tried to show with this rather long-winded talk is how the goal of settling people harmoniously in the natural world, which was very influential around the turn of the century, was not antidotal, but rather formative of the modernist belief that society can be molded by design. Thank you, and I'm happy to address any questions or clarify some of the points I've been trying to make.
Merci beaucoup, Kenny, pour cette conférence très dense. Je passe en français pour éviter que le public soit timide, mais vous pouvez poser des questions en anglais. Enfin, on peut parler dans la langue qui arrange chacun et traduire si nécessaire. Est-ce qu'il y a déjà des questions dans le public, d'étudiants ou de collègues? Alors, s'il n'y en a pas encore, mais j'espère qu'il y en aura, je peux commencer. J'ai une question sur les dimensions de l'environnement que vous avez évoquées. Vous avez beaucoup insisté sur ce qui relève du sol, de la géologie, du paysage, de quelque chose de très visible et de très ancré dans la terre, quelque part. Et c'est aussi le titre de votre projet de recherche, The Earth that Modernism Built. Mais je m'interrogeais sur la dimension climatique de ces théories et de leurs éventuelles influences sur la forme des établissements humains et de l'architecture. Et je pensais, en vous écoutant notamment à des théories de Ellsworth Huntington sur ce qu'on appelle le déterminisme climatique dans le livre Civilization and Climate, d'abord publié en 1915 et réédité dans l'entre-deux-guerres. Est-ce que ça rejoint, enfin, quel est le lien avec ces théories qui portent davantage sur le sol, sur les organismes vivants, sur le paysage? Est-ce qu'il y en a ou est-ce que c'est autre chose? Est-ce que c'est une histoire plus américaine ou britannique que vraiment allemande ou centre-européenne? Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez?
That is a great question, and I think I can only partially answer it. I think one answer is perhaps in the nature of and the contingencies of Germany's colonial project. So even though it had a variety of colonies in the supposedly, or so-called tropical zones of the world, migration to those areas was actually very minimal. And in fact, its kind of premier settler colony was Namibia, German. And I think in the entire period of German colonialism, only 15,000 or 20,000 people or so moved there. So it was actually comparatively minute, and especially considering relationships with larger imperial and much more long-standing peer imperial projects like that of France or Britain. So I think that perhaps gives you one answer to why these kinds of concerns with acclimatization, for instance, were less developed. I think it's in the mid-19th century that the French and the British are concerned with the question of how can white people adopt to the tropics and what that might mean in terms of colonial policy. So Germany didn't participate very much in this kind of trans-imperial debate, let's say, and because it came late to the imperial project, right? Its first colony was in 1884, or officially. So it at least officially came late to empire. And I think that might be one reason why these debates about acclimatization and tropical climates and what they might mean for imperial rule were not so present or not so well developed. That's one partial answer, perhaps.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Et oui, j'aurais dû expliquer que les théories du déterminisme climatique, elles visaient à expliquer le développement des différentes populations du monde en fonction du facteur favorable ou non du climat, en expliquant que c'était dans l'Occident où les températures n'étaient ni trop froides ni trop chaudes que se seraient développées les civilisations les plus évoluées, contrairement à d'autres parties du monde. C'était ce qu'avançaient très grossièrement ces théories à l'époque. Je fais un peu de pédagogie pour le public étudiant. Merci. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions?
Oui, j'aurais peut-être une question qui est en lien avec la tienne, Paul. Merci beaucoup, Kenny, pour formidable intervention. J'aurais en lien peut-être avec la question de Paul sur la place qu'occupe la réflexion sur l'énergie dans justement cette harmonie entre le sol, le settlement, et dans cette biopolitique qui se met en place, la question de l'énergie est dans votre exposé en tout cas pas présente. Je me demandais si c'était le cas dans les ressources, dans les archives que vous traitez, et notamment un peu plus largement aussi sur la fin, on voit une réflexion se développer sur le sorte de progrès par rapport à la technologie qui se développe là, qui est aussi liée directement aux énergies fossiles qui vont permettre d'actionner ces machines. Et donc voilà, un peu largement dans cette harmonie des settlements et de cette biopolitique of settlement, je me demandais quel était le rôle de l'énergie dans cette réflexion. Merci.
Thank you. That's a really great question. And in one of the chapters of my book, the centers on the work of Hermann Zörgl, whose work or project on Atlantropa, some of you might be familiar with. I don't know if you can quickly Google an image of it, Paul. You might. For those who don't know it, this was a kind of a crazy project of transcontinental interconnection. And this was very much also an energy project. This American historian who's written about the kind of energy aspect of this project, can't recall his name, happy to send that reference to you later. This was an idea to connect Africa with Europe that was kind of a German answer also to the Treaty of Versailles, because this excluded Germany from having its own colonies. So for German imperialists to continue to make claims kind of to world leadership, it imagined a kind of pan-European colonization of Africa. And for this, the main tool was infrastructure. And so Zörgl was kind of obsessed with this idea of lowering the level of the Mediterranean Sea to such an extent that you could create land connections between, or rail connections between Europe and Africa. He also recycled older ideas, French colonial ideas, to make the desert bloom. The Sahara, since the mid-19th century, had been an obsession for some French colonists to try and make this fertile or exploitable for French interests. And so he took up also these kinds of ideas. So to create giant dams, for instance, also hydroelectric dams across Africa. He imagined the majority of the Congolese territory to be simply flooded for a massive dam. So this was also a genocidal project, you could argue. But a lot of this was around ideas of energy and energy related to geopolitics. So you could say it's incredibly relevant considering the historical moment we are in today, to think about that relationship between empire, energy, and war.
Thank you very much.
Oui, moi j'aurais peut-être une question. Merci pour cette conférence très intéressante. J'aurais une question sur le... Je me demandais si vous aviez... si vous vous êtes intéressé à d'autres moments où le monde de l'architecture et de l'urbanisme s'est saisi des théories de Ratzel et notamment de l'anthropogéographie, puisque ça a été un moment, je pense par exemple à Vittorio Gregotti en 1966, dans ses textes sur la forme du territoire, qui va, dans un tout autre contexte, mobiliser aussi cette notion d'anthropogéographie, me semble-t-il, pour en faire toute autre chose et pour ouvrir d'autres pistes dans le monde de l'architecture et de l'urbanisme. Est-ce que vous vous êtes un peu intéressé à cette période et à cette scène italienne des années 60?
Certainly interested. I don't know much about it, but I would. The first reference that comes to mind is this French discourse on géographie volontaire that I've written about a little bit, which became dominant in the mid-20th century, and which really built also on an earlier imperialist geography, in this case by Paul Vidal de la Blache, who was, let's say, the French equivalent of Ratzel. Older scholarship has called him, a possibilist, and Ratzel a determinist. But in fact, I think they're really quite similar in terms of their understanding of both the kind of imperialist idea that humanity is shaped by the land, but also the belief, the colonialist belief that you can determine and transform that in the interests of empire, or the interest of humanity as they would see it, empire as I would see it. I think in the post-war period, the French idea also of aménagement du territoire is related, or the rise of this as a kind of professional orientation is related to géographie volontaire. And I think, I don't know, that would be an interesting thing to think about these French-Italian relations, if that was at all important in the development of Gregotti's idea of the architecture of territory. And you can even think about, how contemporary projects by some of my colleagues here or there now in Nairobi at the moment, in Switzerland, the architecture of territory, right? These ideas around designing the earth, how they might be seen as a continuation or a break with these volitionist geographic approaches. I don't know if that doesn't really answer your question, but I'm interested.
Doesn't matter, thank you.
Et oui, je pense qu'il y a, pour faire juste un ajout, beaucoup de liens. J'ai beaucoup pensé aussi pendant la conférence de Kenny à l'importance de l'école de géographie française, qui est peut-être mais je ne connais pas les liens exacts qu'elle entretenait avec les théories allemandes, même si Kenny a dit que c'était des théories qui semblaient s'opposer, mais qui en fait convergeaient en partie selon la focale avec laquelle il les a analysées. Mais je vois aussi Eric, dans les années 60 et 70, ces travaux-là de l'école de géographie française ressurgir sur les questions environnementales au sens large, non seulement comme les pose Grégotti dans ses écrits et ses réflexions sur le territoire, mais aussi chez des gens comme Amos Rapoport pour une anthropologie de la maison, ou House, Form and Culture, où c'est extrêmement présent. Et ces travaux-là inspirent des gens comme Jeanne-Marie Alexandrov plutôt, et d'autres sur des théories plus liées à l'écologisme. Donc il y aurait sans doute un travail à faire pour comprendre ce que la pensée environnementale au sens large des années 60 et 70 emprunte à ces travaux-là, et quels étaient les liens de cette école de géographie française avec les théories allemandes dont Kenny nous a parlé. Très bien. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions ? Alors, j'en aurai une autre sur une question de terminologie. Kenny, vous avez parlé surtout au début de votre présentation de environmentalism, ce qu'on peut traduire en français par environnementalisme, on dit plus familièrement écologisme, même si ils n'ont pas exactement les mêmes définitions. Et c'est un concept que vous utilisiez, que vous situiez quand même à l'époque, que vous analysiez à la fin du 19e et au début du 20e siècle. Et à la fois, je vois tout l'intérêt qu'il y a à retracer, à analyser les origines de ces conceptions-là et de ce terme-là, mais je me demande aussi, mais c'est une question à laquelle je suis confronté aussi dans mes propres travaux, s'il ne faut pas la distinguer aussi, et dans quelle mesure, peut-être pas complètement, mais en partie, de l'environnementalisme ou de l'écologisme tel qu'on l'entend aujourd'hui. Est-ce que vous pourriez commenter le shift qu'il y a ? Et est-ce que l'écologisme dont on parle aujourd'hui n'est pas davantage héritier de celui des années 60 et 70 et qui lui entretient des liens un peu plus lointains avec celui des années 10 ou 20 ? Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez ?
Yeah, that is a very good question. I do think that the post-war environmentalism is, of course, plays a much bigger role in today's debate. But I think it's also, so I think it used to I think German was easily dismissed as like an aesthetic movement that didn't really get at the kind of the underlying material ecologies of urban transformation, and was kind of a stylistic device. And certainly you could see how this kind of architecture as it was built is not more than that. So in that sense, this is also certainly not something we should go back to. My interest is rather to understand how some leftovers or some the afterlives, let's say, of this moment still play a role in how we understand the environment today. So I'd rather not use a very linear understanding of how these concepts change, but rather see things as kind of like erupting from the past into the present, rather than a linear development of ideas. So in that sense, there is some use to looking at the past, but of course it's limited. And I think looking at the post-war period is certainly more productive for kind of activist scholarship, perhaps.
Je vais essayer je vais tenter une question peut-être un peu critique. On va voir. Kenny, dans votre conférence, vous mettez bien en évidence tous les liens qu'il peut y avoir entre déterminisme, fonctionnalisme, exploitation de la terre, racisme, colonialisme. Aidé aussi par le fait que ces idées se développent dans une période très marquée par ces thèmes. Et c'est des liens qui semblent assez évidents lorsqu'on lit, par exemple, les travaux du Heimat Schutz. Et surtout, quand on regarde la trajectoire de Paul Schulz-Naumbourg et ce qu'il va écrire quand il deviendra nazi dans les années 30-40. Avec le risque de la téléologie, c'est-à-dire d'examiner la portée de certaines théories au regard de ce qu'elles vont donner. Bon. Mais à la fois, je me dis que, par exemple, le Heimat Schutz est aussi une critique de la première modernisation, c'est aussi une critique du productivisme, une critique de la table rase. Et ça ouvre de ce point de vue une autre voie aussi que celle que va emprunter la modernité. Et de la même manière, quand on parlait des années 60 et 70, c'est aussi ces idées-là qui ont circulé et qui vont servir d'autres, j'allais dire, d'autres causes politiques ou idéologiques, quoi, hein. Et moi, il me semble qu'il serait intéressant, et ça serait peut-être ma question, de voir, j'allais dire, on voit bien tout ce qui relie ces thèmes, mais j'aimerais vous entendre peut-être davantage sur ce qui les différencie, c'est-à-dire sur les moments où ces idées, où ces théories ont pu avoir d'autres issues, d'autres débouchés. Voilà, pour éviter d'appliquer un certain déterminisme justement à certaines idées du fait qu'elles ont été construites dans un contexte politique, idéologique, historique particulier.
That's a good question. I take your point that this account itself could be read as quite deterministic, if I understand you well. And certainly, what I'm doing in this project is to emphasize one line, right? So there were other uses to the Heimatschutz that were not connected to an explicitly racist project of improvement or to a colonial project, right? But I'm trying to, I guess I'm very much inspired by scholarship that tries to think modernity and coloniality always related. And so without creating a kind of determinism, as you say, that everything modern is always in the service of colonial power, but rather to try and understand the aspect of coloniality, if I can use that word, as different from colonialism, to see how Heimatschutz was part of a particular moment of German modernity that was intrinsically linked to an imperial worldview in which colonialism was a kind of natural given. So to come back to your point, I do think there's historical moments to retrieve, right? Maybe even emancipatory projects by people from the Heimatschutz movement. I'm thinking of some of these social reform colonies, for instance. But what my interest is in trying to understand this as a particular configuration of power. So let's take, for instance, the Eden project, this vegetarian, community of people who are interested in a vegetarian lifestyle, and they would go to the outskirts of the imperial metropolis to plant strawberries and live off the land, right? And this is, of course, kind of a hippie project, if you want, avant la lettre. And yes, sure, there was an emancipatory aspect to this. But at the same time, these things this community was also very fickle, and as has been documented, also quite a fervent Nazi territory in the 1920s and 30s. So yes, I think there is always things to redeem and retrieve from the past. I don't want to throw Heimatschutz entirely into the garbage bin. But my, let's say, project here is to just show how modernism's kind of inherent or tendency to authoritarianism comes from an imperial approach to planetary inhabitation. I think that's my kind of the main argument I'm trying to make. And so if you think about environmental determinism as this 19th century strong 19th century idea that mobilized power in a certain direction. And you think about environmental determination as kind of modernism's core belief, if I can say that, right? The idea that you can kind of create certain outcomes, social outcomes by planning the environment. Then I would say this calls for demodernism in the sense that I would believe rather in environmental autonomy as a kind of way to think about how we engage with the environment. So environmental determinism and environmental determination, but for today, environmental autonomy. And I'm interested in the work of Arturo Escobar on autonomy, relational autonomy, and design futures, I think he calls it grandly. So I would hold that up as hope for today.
Merci.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions? Peut-être une dernière question. Alors, s'il n'y en a pas, j'en aurai une dernière qui fait écho à celle d'Éric, mais peut-être sous un autre angle. C'est une question qu'on pose souvent dans nos conférences, dans les conférences qu'on organise dernièrement, c'est sur la portée de votre travail et la manière d'écrire peut-être une nouvelle histoire de l'architecture ou de réviser les histoires de l'architecture existantes. Et pour le formuler de manière un peu abrupte, si on prolongeait votre conférence d'aujourd'hui, est-ce que vous pensez qu'on écrirait une nouvelle histoire du Bauhaus, une histoire radicalement différente, qui formulerait des interprétations inédites, peut-être iconoclastes sur toute l'expérience très productive du Bauhaus, non seulement en Allemagne, mais dans son influence en Occident et dans le monde? Ou est-ce que vous dites que votre travail il éclaire les influences intellectuelles, les théories sous-jacentes à la pédagogie du Bauhaus, et que c'est plus là qu'il y a à le voir, sans forcément remettre en cause les interprétations qu'il y a d'un groupe d'enseignants et d'architectes et d'artistes comme ceux du Bauhaus. Comment vous situez votre travail dans un récit plus grand de l'histoire de l'architecture? C'est une question difficile.
Yeah, I think so. I'll do my best. So I think this can be interpreted or criticized by, I think, specialists in the history of modern architecture in Germany, because it questioned a long-standing division that has been that has endured despite, let's say, persistent attacks. And that is a distinction or a division between, the good and the bad, if I may be simplistic, the good international, progressive, modernists with social ideas, and then the kind of nationalist reactionary designers like Schulz and Naumburg. And we previously have put them in a camp called anti-modernism. Now we understand that is just as modern. So it's a kind of fascist modernism, if you will. But I think this division is not very useful to create a history of architecture that has relevance for today, I think. Because I think it doesn't, it doesn't really help us understand how some of these supposedly enlightened designs had very negative consequences, and were not necessarily progressive to all of those who experienced them. And so a more critical history, I think, would aim to understand how certain ways of thinking and certain ways of doing that transcend political ideology might be questioned as we move on and face the challenges that we're facing today.
Ok. Merci beaucoup pour cette réponse qui élargissait le champ, et merci beaucoup d'avoir partagé aujourd'hui votre travail en cours qu'on a hâte de lire. Vous parliez d'un livre en préparation, donc j'espère qu'on aura l'occasion de le lire bientôt et de le discuter. Mais c'était très précieux pour nous de vous entendre aujourd'hui, plus seulement sur l'histoire des grands ensembles qui commencent à être diffusés dans nos milieux, mais aussi sur ce projet-là. Et voilà, j'espère qu'on aura l'occasion de rééchanger sur ces sujets. Et je me dois d'annoncer la conférence de la semaine prochaine où nous recevrons la paysagiste nord-américaine, je ne sais plus si elle est des États-Unis ou du Canada, Jane Ma Hutton, pour une conférence intitulée Reciprocal Landscapes, Stories of Material Movements, qui s'annonce passionnante également. On connaît un peu son travail. Donc, merci encore, Kenny, pour la conférence et à ceux qui ont posé des questions, ainsi qu'au public pour son attention.
Et merci à vous, à tous, pour l'invitation. Merci.
Merci. On a vérifié que vous compreniez parfaitement le français avec les questions.